think it's remarkable how hard it's proven to be to come up with any logically consistent theory of physics which predicts only the universe that we can observe, this spherical region of space from which light has reached us so far during the 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang, and nothing else. I don't have a single colleague who takes seriously the idea that space ends here. You just have to wait a few billion years to see the light from these more distant galaxies. Inflation predicts space is vastly larger than this, probably even infinite. Quantum mechanics predicts that reality is even bigger by there being alternative histories unfolding, in a sense, right here. And if the mathematical universe hypothesis, that I'm a big fan of, is true, then reality is grander still. If you turn this around, I think the main reason people have resisted parallel universes is just because they feel it sounds too weird. But I think that's a really, really bad argument, frankly, because what do you expect? We have intuition that evolution has given us for things which were useful for our ancestors. That's the reason we have intuition for baseball, for example, is because it was really useful to not get hit by rocks that people threw them at us, and to be able to predict how the rocks and spears that we threw would fly and hit the antelope. And as soon as we use technology to go beyond the human scale and look at things that our ancestors had no access to, we should predict, therefore, that we shouldn't have, our intuition should break down. And we can test this. Look what happened. We look at things much smaller than the human scale, and we see particles being in multiple places at once. That's really weird. We look at things much bigger than us. Black holes, if people don't feel that's weird, they haven't understood them. We look at things going much faster than the human scale, and time slows down. That's pretty weird in my book. You look at things that are much hotter than the human scale, with all the particles flying around near the speed of light. You collide together some particles at CERN near the speed of light. You collide together a couple of protons, and out comes some Higgs bosons and other weird stuff. That's about as intuitive as colliding together two Volkswagens and gaining out 3 trains in a cruise ship. You know, so I think the verge is already in. The reality is weird. And if we are so narrow-minded that we're only going to study theories that we think are not weird, we're never going to find the true theory.
きることよりもまるで死ぬことを願っているようにも見えました。私が生を受けたこの国はなぜこんなにも貧しいのでしょう。人々は苦しみや悲しみだけを味わうためにこの地上に生まれてきたようではありませんか。
社会、それがお前には悲しいか。
当然です。苦しみだけの人生など誰が望みましょう。
それは違う。苦しみがあれば必ず喜びがある。その逆もまたしかり。美しい花が咲く。それもいつかは散る。この世に生あるものは一瞬たりともとどまってはおらぬ。常に動き変わる。それを無常という。人の一生も同じなのだ。
しかし最後に決定的な死が待つ限り、やはり人生を支配するのは悲しみなのではありませんか。生きている間にいかに苦しみを克服しようと愛を求め喜びを求めたとしても、結局は死が全てを無にしてしまう。それなのに人間はなぜ生まれてくるのでしょう。死という完璧で永遠なるものに逆らうことなど決してできはしないのに。
社会をお前は忘れているぞ。
忘れている。
それを
serious and profound problems and questions and issues could be discussed only in the form of jokes. I mean, I know in U.S. lit, there's a tradition from about the 50s and 60s called black humor, which is a very kind of sardonic, sad type of humor. I'm grasping for something interesting to say in response. I think probably sometimes it can be, and sometimes it isn't. There are forms of humor that offer escapes from pain, and there are forms of humor that transfigure pain.
Because in your books.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
okay.
Perfectly.
Okay. Now the perspiration starts. Okay.
It's
It would help. You know what would help me? Tell me what you think. Like, if we do this as a conversation, it will be easier for me.
Yeah, sure. And I wrote my master thesis about Thomas Bernhard, and Thomas Bernhard, there's a theory that he was had this lung sickness, so he couldn't breathe all his life. And his life was very hard for him. And also he hated Austria where he lived, and he thought they were all Nazis, and it was all this Catholic passion, and he was just hating everything. But then out of that he developed this really kind of strange sense of humor. So his novels are very dark, but at the same time for me very witty, and also this humor comes in some sort of music and all that. But I just wanted to know if you think that is true, that the kind of sense of humor you like, comes out of this bitterness, sadness, or if this is a cliche. Sometimes it's also a cliche, it's like this tragic comic.
The answer for myself is I don't know. I know that I know that that very often humor is a response to things that are difficult. In the U.S., there's a strange situation where, in some respects, humor and irony are political responses, and they're redemptive. And in another sense, particularly in popular entertainment, irony and a kind of dark humor can become a way of it's pretending to protest when it really isn't. Someone once called irony the song of a bird that has come to love its cage, and even though it sings about not liking the cage, it really likes it in there. There's a it can be so that it can be both a wake-up call and an anesthetic, and the difference in the U.S. now is very tricky and very complicated, it seems to me.
And what would you think is true for your books? I mean, for me, they have all this. They are about very serious questions, and they are often very sad, but at the same time, you get this sense of humor in there somehow. I'm not often all that aware of stuff that's really funny in the book. In the American version of Infinite Jest, I set out to write a sad book, and when people liked it and told me that the thing they liked about it was that it was so funny, it was just very surprising. It's the other strange thing about humor. I teach school and I teach literature, and some of what I teach is Kafka, and there's a story about Kafka that in some of Kafka's most horrific stories, his neighbors would complain because he would be laughing so hard late at night as he wrote these stories. He found them very, very funny. And there are things in them that are funny, but I don't know that many people would understand laughing so hard that your neighbors would complain. So there's something, it's probably difficult to talk to a writer about the humor or sadness or something
in his or her own work because our sense of it tends to be very different from readers.
Yeah, but there was one interview he gave, I forgot which media it was, but he said when you again write Jest, you wanted to write something about sadness. So sadness was something that really belonged to Kubrick's project. So could you describe what you
the easiest way to talk about it would be that for the upper middle class in the U.S., particularly younger people, things are often materially very comfortable, and there's also often a great sadness and emptiness, and it's difficult to think about and difficult to come up with answers in the abstract. And I think I had started that book after a couple of people, not close friends, but people I knew who were my age had committed suicide. There was just a it just became obvious that something was going on, and I know that impulse was part of starting the book. The book is so long though, and took so long to write, that it's almost hard to remember the impulses at the beginning because everything sort of changes. I mean, it's something you live with for years and years rather than something that you just have an idea or a feeling and you just do. I think one of the ideas of the book is that there's a particular ethos in U.S. culture, especially in entertainment and marketing culture, that very much appeals to people as individuals, that you don't have to be devoted or subservient to anything else. There is no larger good than your own good and your own happiness. And that in the book, as best I can recall, characters who become drug addicts, there's a form that the root in English of addict is the Latin addicere, which means religious devotion. It was an attribute of beginning monks, I think. There's an element in the book in which various people are living out something that I think is true, which is that we all worship and we all have a religious impulse. We can choose to an extent what we worship, but the myth that we worship nothing and give ourselves away to nothing is simply sets us up to give ourselves away to something different. For instance, pleasure or drugs, or the idea of having a lot of money and being able to buy nice stuff. Or in the tennis academy, it's somewhat different. It's devotion to an athletic pursuit that requires a certain amount of sacrifice and discipline, but is nevertheless an individual sport, and one's trying to get ahead as an individual. I doubt this makes very much sense, but whatever the conditions of hopelessness you're talking about, at least in Infinite Jest, have to do, I think, with an American idea, and not a universal one, but one that I think kids get exposed to very early, that you are the most important, and what you want is the most important, and that your job in life is to gratify your own desires. That's a little crude to say it that way, but in fact it's something of the ideology here, and it's certainly the ideology that's perpetrated by television and advertising and entertainment the economy thrives on it.
And what happens when this ideology becomes always there?
Oh, am I? Oh, God, sorry. Shit, I was halfway lucid for a second there, too. And it probably didn't come through?
That was fine.
I was feeling lucid.
I promise it was fine. Yeah, I went out for just the last question there as well. But it's kind of hard because you're sitting out.
Yeah, okay.
I move in and out?
Oh, yeah.
You know, the thing is, the background is not too pretty, of course, and that's why we're not showing.
I'm sorry.
No,
That's
no,
okay. That's okay.
no, because you're pontificating.
Thank you.
You have to.
There's a
In
nice
very
word.
deep,
Thank you.
spiritual way. Okay, which is completely screwing me. You're right. You just
Twitching. I'm sorry? Well, these are hard questions. Particularly when it's about something you did like 7 years ago. Yeah. I would trade places with you at this point. Well, of course, nobody tells. I mean, mom and dad don't sit you down and say this. This is something. This is something very subtle and is delivered by a great many messages. In just conversationally, do you get what I'm talking about? I rather doubt that Europeans' idea of America is very different from this. I mean, this is an enormous. This is one enormous engine and temple of self-gratification and self-advancement, and in some ways it works very, very well. In other ways, it doesn't work all that well because at least for me, it seems as if there are whole other parts of me that need to worry about things larger than me that don't get nourished in that system. From the Europeans I've talked to, yeah, in the early 60s, and to an extent, I think my generation tends to think of itself as urban still, and as people with parents, and I remember wanting to do something about what would be the situation of our children. Language like that, the lingering and violating pain of psychological movement in the United States today is a sort of popular Freudianism that has its own paradox, which is that the more we're taught to list and resent the things of which we want to try as children, the more we live in our anger and frustration that's a very simple phrase, but I think the character in that story is sort of a compendium of kind of all the worst and most painful features of the popular psychology movement in the U.S. And I don't know whether there's any analog to that in Western Europe or not. Let me insert one thing, which I'll bet you've noticed from talking to writers, is that most of the stuff that we think we're writing about in books is very difficult to talk about straight up. Question and answer, and in some sense, it probably can't be talked about directly, and that's why people make up stories about it. This is all a big defense because I feel like what I'm saying is so simple and so reductive. To the extent that I understand it, being what you call grown up isn't a lot of fun a lot of the time. There are things you have to do. There are things you want to do that you can't for a variety of reasons, and I think that for young people in America, there are very mixed messages from the culture. There's a streak of moralism in American life that extols the virtues of being grown up and having a family and being a responsible citizen. But there's also the sense of do what you want, gratify your appetite, because when I'm a corporation, appealing to the parts of you that are selfish and self-centered and want to have fun all the time is the best way to sell you things, right? And the point that emerges from that is that it's, I think, one more example of American economic and cultural systems that work very well in terms of selling people products and keeping the economy thriving do not work as well when it comes to educating children or helping us help each other know how to live and to be happy, if that word means anything. Clearly it means something different from whatever I want to do. I want to take this cup and throw it right now. I have every right to. I should. We see it with children. That's not happiness. That feeling of having to obey every impulse and gratify every desire it seems to me to be a strange kind of slavery. Nobody talks about it as such, though. It talks about freedom of choice, and you have the right to have things, and spend this much money and you can have this stuff. Again, saying it this way, it sounds to me very crude and very simple, but does this make any sense to you? No. But I mean, but what you've spent time in the U.S. Is this some? Running an economy and keeping goods produced and sold, and it works wonderfully. The ways in which it doesn't work are much more difficult to talk about. One's reduced to talking, I think, about general terms like being grown up, or a term that's really used anymore. And now I feel embarrassment because I'm going to sound like my grandfather or something. But the word citizen, the idea of being a citizen would be to understand your country's history and the things about it that are good and not so good, and how the system works, and taking the trouble to learn about candidates for political office, which means often stuff which it isn't fun. Sometimes it's boring. But when people don't do that, here's what happens. The candidates win who have the most money to buy television advertisements, because television advertisements are almost voters know about the candidates. Therefore, we get candidates who are beholden to large donors and become, in some ways, corrupt, which disgusts the voters and makes the voters even less interested in politics, less willing to read and do the work and do the work of citizenship. When I was a little boy, there was a class called citizenship. Here are certain things about America's history. Here's why it's important to vote. Here's why it's important not just to go in and vote for who the best looking candidate is. Here's what's really interesting. I don't know if you can translate this. Talking about this now, I feel ashamed, because my saying all this sounds to me like an older person saying this, like a person lecturing, which in American culture sets me up to be ridiculed. It would be very easy to make fun of what I'm saying. It would be very, very easy to make fun of what I'm saying, and I can hear in my head a voice making fun of this stuff because I'm saying it. And this is the kind of paradox, I think, of what it is, of what it is to be a halfway intelligent American right now, and probably also a Western European, is that there are things we know are right and good and would be better for us to do, but constantly it's like, yeah, but it's so much funnier and nicer to go do something else. Who cares? And it's all bullshit. And one of the things it causes is tension and unhappiness in people. don't think it's very complicated, and I don't think I've named the only reason for it. The paradox is that sort of tension and complication and conflict in people also makes them very easy to market to. Because I could say to you, oh, feeling uneasy, life feels empty. Here's something you can buy or something you can go do. It makes us, it makes for, the economics term is inelasticity of demand. I demand all the time, no matter what the price of it is, and it works really well in an economic way, emotionally, spiritually, in terms of citizenship, in terms of feeling like a meaningful part, even of this country. Forget the world, and I'm sure the U.S. government's sort of arrogance and disdain for the rest of the world is unpleasant, but it's also a natural extension of certain cultural messages we send ourselves about ourselves that work very well in some ways and make us very rich and very powerful. It's all complicated.
So, we are somehow addicted to having fun with people. In so-called serious literature, it's that, so you don't want to make this effort anymore. Books who are serious also have to be very entertaining. You don't want to be bored. And that's, I think 20, 30 years ago, you could still read a book and it wouldn't be this kind of work to do, but you wouldn't think, well, I have to be entertained all the time. So how do we get out of this dilemma? Maybe for intellectuals, it has to be entertaining, not boring.
I don't know that I'd agree with the last part of what you said. There's a real split. It's interesting that you went and interviewed Crichton because there's a real split in U.S. literature between commercial literature, novels like that Crichton writes, Stephen King, Tom Clancy, who are the other big, Grisham, the law guy, some of which are really pretty good, but and they make a great deal of money, and there's a whole lot of demand for them. And then there is still, and I think it's probably like this well, it's probably not quite. There's probably more demand for serious books in Europe, but here there's a small pocket of probably I don't know, 500,000, say 1 million readers who, many of whom are from the upper classes and have good educations and have been taught the pleasures of hard work in reading or music or art and like that. So I mean, when you're talking to me, you're talking to somebody who doesn't have very much power in the culture and who's not very important except in a fairly small. I don't know what the analog would be. It would be something like maybe contemporary classical music in the U.S., which there are people who enjoy it and listen to it, partly because of training and partly because they're disposed to be willing to do a certain amount more work reading it. But compared to popular music and rock and roll and hip hop and stuff, classical music is nothing. I mean, economically or commercially, or in terms of how many people have heard of it, or how much an influence it has on the culture. So, and for me personally, I don't know that it's really ever been all that different. I think probably American education used to be a little bit better and a little bit more difficult, and children had no choice but to realize that there were certain things that were hard and involved a certain amount of drudgery that were actually very satisfying at the end of it. But for the most part, I think in the U.S., people who've been doing, quote, serious stuff, which is harder and stranger, have always played to a much smaller audience. In terms of what can be done about the dilemma, first of all, I'm wondering who would care what I think, and second, I'm not sure, and third, what do you think? I mean, you live in the same atmosphere I do.
I think it's really a problem because in Germany we have this TV literary expert, and he called him the literary pope. So he's the pope. I think that is something that is true, that
humor can only come out of something sad, or do you think that is a cliche?
I know that Wittgenstein believed that the most serious and profound problems and questions and issues could be discussed only in the form of jokes. And I know